Right, so thank you all for coming today. I hope you're having a good open campus visit. My name is, indicated here, is Shaun. I'm an anthropology professor here at ICU. I've been here since 1995, in fact, so I am one of the older generation at this university. And I'm also director of in the graduate school, the graduate program for public policy and social research. And so it's in that capacity today that I was asked to give a model lecture. Lecturing for the graduate school is a little bit, did anybody go to an undergraduate lecture? Not yet? Okay. The undergraduate ones are going to be a little bit different. The graduate school classes are, at ICU, tend to be very small, usually 10 students or less. And they tend to run more of a seminar style. And so it's kind of impossible for me to come in and run a seminar when we don't have a chance to prepare the materials or anything in advance. So what I've decided to do was to talk a little bit about something from my own work. And in anthropology, one of the course that I teach in the graduate school is the Anthropology of Violence. And it is a course that looks at violence in human societies from a variety of different perspectives. We start off with basically physical anthropology. We look at research related to, for example, chimpanzees and other primates. And then we go further along and look at it in a number of different cultural ways. But one of the things that is always of great interest to the students in my class, when I teach it, is a section of the course that I call Legacies of Violence, dealing with the legacies of violence. And this is a very active area of research in anthropology. We see, obviously, conflict. We see violence in many, many societies around the world. And so in the discipline of anthropology, our question is, how can we engage with this? Anthropologists, basically most anthropologists are sort of socially minded, want to, as they say, make a difference, and many take a more activist type of approach to things. And so dealing with the legacy of violence is one of them. And so to start things off, I want to ask you, and this is the one time, does everybody have a cell phone? Smartphone? You can take it out. This is the one time I allow people to do this. So please take it out if you have one. If you have a computer, this will work as well. And if you go to this, right here, you go to www.menti.com, and they'll ask you to input a code. And that code is, if you can't read my handwriting, that's 551393. Anybody in the classroom can do it if you're, even if you're just here to, as staff. Please go ahead and answer there's one question once you get in there. And the question is, do you think that anthropology can contribute to post-conflict societies? And you have one of three answers: a yes, a no, and an unsure. So go ahead and answer online there. And I'll get instant feedback from you. And so what we'll do is we'll start this off. And you can do this as well if you want to pull out your phone and go to this website, and you can answer this survey question. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll put these up in the beginning, and then we will ask the question again at the end of the lecture. This is one of my favorite teaching devices because it allows, especially in big classes, instant feedback on questions. Okay, so you can do that. And so to move into while you're doing that, I can start with the getting into the content of the lecture. And as I indicate here, this lecture's purpose is to understand some of the ways that anthropology can contribute to improving situations in post-conflict societies, some of the things that we can help others with. And in doing this, this is a very large field of anthropology. But what I want to look at is this one, ritual. How is it when we look at rituals being employed, how can they resolve what I will describe as culturally informed problems? Problems that have a unique kind of cultural dimension that conflict can create. But in particular, what we'll want to think about here is especially violence. How is it violence creates particular culturally informed problems, conundrums? And so how can we look at a classic part of the anthropological research program, ritual, one of our main areas of research, and how can we use our anthropological tools to understand these problems and see in particular how societies are coming up with unique, innovative ways to resolve some of the culturally informed problems that violence creates. So, and what we'll do is we're going to look at two main foci here. One of them is going to be the loss of corpses of family members. And this is from my own research. I am a Vietnam specialist. I did a number of years of research in Vietnam. And in particular, I was working in North Vietnam. And in working there, one of the big issues was what in the United States we described as missing in action. In the Vietnam War, you had many Vietnamese who went off to the front and their bodies never came home. And so this, for the Vietnamese, is a sort of unique cultural problem. And so I want to go through some of the ways that this has worked out in Vietnam. And then the second one I want to look at is the reintegration of child soldiers. Now this one is my research, but the second one is actually research done by one of my graduate students. This graduate student by the name of Karis Hughes, who was here a number of years ago. And she was interested in the reintegration of female child soldiers in Uganda. If you've studied the histories of conflict in recent decades, places like Sri Lanka, African societies, you've seen many, many child soldiers involved in these conflicts. And anthropologists and other NGOs have been very active in trying to reintegrate these child soldiers into their societies post-conflict. So we are going to look at her work and my work sort of more broadly. Now, currently we have 6 responses. We have 4 yes that anthropology can contribute and 2 unsure. Nobody's saying no, so you probably wouldn't have come here if you thought it was no. But anyway, so let's get into this and start off with my own research. And we'll cover this from Vietnam and the second one from Uganda. And theoretically in anthropology, what we recognize is that conflict, notably the violence it entails, can create culturally specific problems. That because of the way cultures are set up, particular issues can emerge. And the approach we'll start off with, then looking at my case and the Uganda case, is that ritual can be a meaningful way of resolving these issues. It can become a meaningful way of solving culturally specific problems. So, the case we'll look at then is we're going to, over here in Vietnam, and I did my research just south of that star there in the city of Hanoi, and then over here in Uganda. And the group we'll be looking at is in northern Uganda and South Sudan. And so it's on the northern border of the country. And so my student, when she was doing her research, was working actually in refugee camps in this part of the country. And so she went and did firsthand research in these communities and went and was talking with the members of the community, talking to the girls that were being reintegrated, and so it would be in this part of the world. And we'll also have a couple references to some other places here, but that is our general geographical focus. So let's turn then and introduce a little bit of theory. Anybody here ever read Robert Hertz? Probably no. Nobody reads Robert Hertz anymore, which is unfortunate because he's a brilliant social scientist. He was French. He was a student of the great French sociologist Émile Durkheim. And so in the very early 20th century, a very active school of sociology in Paris in particular. And Hertz was one of Durkheim's star students. Born in 1881, died in 1915. Sadly, he was killed in the First World War. So we're going to talk about unquiet dead, and this is something that Hertz developed, and ultimately he would die in warfare as well. And he wrote a long essay called A Contribution to the Study of the Collective Representation of Death, published in 1907. If you're interested, it was originally published in French. If you can't read the French, then there is a book called Death in the Right Hand, and this has the text in it. And so it was published in 1960, and so the quotations you're going to see here are from that volume. And so Hertz, like Durkheim before him, was very interested in how do societies handle death. Death occurs in every society, but in what ways is it culturally dealt with? What's one of the most obvious ways that we see? What do you do after? What's the next common step after? Funerals. And funerals are a standard way of looking at death. And what we see is funerals are universal. You see them in every society. There's some form of recognizing what happens to people, of some way of recognizing death and how you sort of put the person to peace. And Hertz, in starting off his talking about death, said, quote, "The body of the deceased is not regarded like the carcass of some animal. Specific care must be given to it and a correct burial, not merely for reasons of hygiene, but out of moral obligation." And it's these last two words that are really important for understanding Hertz, because what he's arguing here is that when we think about what happens at death, the living have moral obligations to the deceased. And you see this very clearly in funeral rites. If you think about it here in Japan, one of the unique ones is if a person is cremated, is the collecting of the bones by family members. And this is a moral obligation. This is a way of showing respect, of showing care for the deceased. So Hertz made this argument that certain things need to be done. And what he argued as well is that death is a social transition. And we think of it simply as from living to deceased, but also there are, as we look at different societies, you also see a kind of sociology of the dead. Where do they go? Do they go to heaven? Do they go to the land of the ancestors? Whatever it may be. And so part of this then, in looking at Hertz, is that he recognized there was this transition, but this transition is dependent upon the living. The living need to help the person go to that next level. Okay. A couple of other nice quotes from him for us to think about that shows this sociology, where he says, "It is only at the end of this period, at the time of the second funeral, and thanks to a special ceremony, that it will enter the land of the dead." And here again, these last 5 words are critical. The land of the dead. That tells us that we have this idea of sort of the world of the deceased, and it's the land of the dead. And in this one, he has another nice phrasing for it. "A funeral service is performed which changes the condition of the soul. Namely, it puts an end to its anxiety by solemnly introducing it into the society of the dead." So another phrasing of this, that's there is this place where the dead go. But what's really important about these two passages, though, is it really brings home the fact that the living need to do this. The dead can't do it on their own. If they're going to enter the society of the dead, if they're going to enter the land of the dead, the living survivors must do something, and in particular, some sort of funeral rite. And if you think about it, if you've been to a funeral before, and you think about it, this should make sense to you. I've been to funerals in America, I've been to funerals in Vietnam, here in Japan, and every place has a similar type of idea of how do we help the soul of the deceased get to some place where they need to go. Okay, and then with Hertz, though, to come back to this idea of the unquiet dead, what he argued, he says, finally, the type of death also causes numerous exceptions to the normal ritual. All those who die a violent death or by an accident, women dying in childbirth, people killed by drowning or by lightning, and suicides are often the object of special rites. Their bodies inspire the most intense horror and are got rid of precipitately. Furthermore, the bones are not laid with those of other deceased members of the group who died a normal death. Their unquiet and spiteful souls roam the earth forever, or if they emigrate to another world, they live in a separate village, sometimes even in a completely different area from that inhabited by other souls. He's talking about a society in what we now call Indonesia here, but he tells us something very important here. Number one is that societies have ideas about a normal death. As I'll describe it, a good death and a bad death. And what he's telling us here, though, is that with people, when they die deaths that are not considered normal, it can make dealing with the soul of the deceased even more difficult. It can become more complicated. And this is the situation we're going to see in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, with my research, I've done a lot of work on this. And to come into, tie this into a little bit with Hertz, then, as we think about in Vietnam, when we think about how funeral rites work, the main focus of it is the soul. Okay, so in the Vietnamese conception of the human body. When the body is alive, every wrong tone on that. Whoops. Every society, every person has a soul. It's called the linh hồn in Vietnamese. And when the physical body stops, the soul lives on. And so when you ask the Vietnamese about what exists, souls exist. They are real. They are part of their world. And when we think about Vietnamese funerary rites, then, when you ask, well, what is their purpose when people are conducting funeral rites? What is it they're trying to do? In the Vietnamese conception, they want to send the person to what they refer to as the other world. And the other world is very interesting. It's exactly like ours. And with a proper funeral rite, then, the living will get the soul of the deceased to this other world. But here's the problem that will come up with in warfare, is that in order for this to happen, the family must possess the corpse. They must have the body. And so if you go to the Vietnamese countryside, for example, when a person dies, they will often have the casket in the house for several days, usually 3 days, and they'll hold funeral rites within the house. And in Vietnamese society, then, we have ideas of good deaths and bad deaths, as Hertz would call a normal death. And on this point, in Vietnam, to die good death would be elderly, to have children. In Vietnam, with similar to what you have here in Japan or what you have in China, you have a family ancestral cult, and you'll have annual rituals, death anniversary ceremonies, things like this, and ideally a male child to survive you to take over the family ancestral cult. To die at home, and also to die near the family altar. And the reason this is that in Vietnamese ideas, when the soul leaves the body, it can see around it, and if it's in a familiar place, it doesn't get scared, it doesn't get shocked, and so it makes it easier to send the deceased to the other world. And being near the altar is important as well, because in a way the soul will transition through that altar. But what are some ideas of a bad death? To die young, to die childless, to die violently, to die by accident, to die away from home, and in particular when the corpse is missing. These are all classic definitions of bad deaths. And so when you think about it then, what does this tell us? What is a death in warfare? Usually it's often this: to die young, to die violently, to die away from home, and in many cases in Vietnam, to not have the body. And in Vietnamese, then, ideas, what this in particular creates then is the possibility that the soul will become a ghost. And ghosts, to come back here, ghosts don't make it to the other world. Ghosts are stuck here. Ghosts are stuck in the world around us. And ghosts are by definition angry because they're stuck here. They're often malevolent, and they are sort of perpetually unhappy. And so when you think about it, this is the last thing that family members want for their deceased loved one, to be stuck as a ghost. And so with war death, then, you had literally millions of bad deaths. And in the Vietnamese case, it's estimated somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 to 300,000 corpses that were never returned. And so you have then this very, very, to put it in terms of the lecture, this very painful legacy of violence, of people whose corpses are lost and they're no longer able to be transitioned to the other world. And so how then does this culturally created or culturally informed problem get solved? One of them is an active government effort. Anybody been to Vietnam? If you travel around Vietnam, one of the things you'll see is numerous cemeteries, just hundreds of cemeteries devoted to war dead. And the government has been very active in doing this. And so there's been an effort to legitimize these war deaths. But what's been interesting, and this is something that's been part of my own research, is that people have turned to popular religious activities to solve this. And there are a couple of very interesting ones. If you are sort of gripped by this topic, if you go online and search, like Google, for example, you'll find all kinds of images related to this. And one of them and another related issue to this is that in Vietnam you have many graves that have no name. So they discover a body, like on a battlefield, and they dig up the body, they bury it, but they don't know the name. And so many Vietnamese families then are desperate to find out who are in these graves. And if you go to some cemeteries, you'll see sort of nameless soldiers throughout. And so what are some of the things that they do? One of them that's really interesting is an egg balancing divination rite. And what this involves is you'll have the grave, and then they'll take a chopstick and they'll sort of push it down, and so it's straight up and down. And then they'll take an egg, and then they'll put it on top of the chopstick. And if it balances, and it's a yes or no answer, is this the remains of my husband, for example? And if it balances, the answer is yes. And if it falls, the answer is no. And so if you do comb through the internet, you will see a lot of images of eggs on top of chopsticks. And I know I have a colleague over at Gaidai in Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and he's seen a lot of these, and he has pictures of these eggs balanced on top of the chopsticks. And so this has become a very important way of determining these. Another one that's interesting as well is the emergence of what the Vietnamese call ngoại cảm specialists. And to break this down a little bit, in Vietnamese, cảm is a verb that means sort of to feel, okay? And so if you look at the language of emotion, you're going to see a lot of uses of cảm in it. But ngoại means external. In Japanese, you have uchi soto. The Vietnamese have the same thing. Nội, ngoại. And ngoại is external, so that would be soto. And so this is a way of people who have this ability to sort of sense things outside of their bodies. And so they're called ngoại cảm. There are dozens of these, and some of them have been credited with finding thousands of remains. And there's some dispute about this, but you can actually, if you read Vietnamese, there is a Vietnamese Wikipedia page devoted to ngoại cảm, and you can see the specialists who are there. And it's really quite a fascinating trend that has emerged. And if you get interested in this, there's a nice video called Psychic Vietnam. It was done by the Vietnamese in 2006. And sometimes it's on YouTube, sometimes it's not, depending if the BBC is policing YouTube or not. But it shows you these specialists at work. And it's a very powerful documentary to watch. And it shows you, in a very important way, again, to come back to this issue of the legacies of violence, how Vietnamese are turning to sort of existing ritual practices as a way to deal with these culturally constructed issues. And at the end of the video, there is an interview with a widow who lost her husband, and in the video they find him through the consultation with the ngoại cảm, and then they find him, and she says, and it's a very powerful, really poignant scene where she says, "My mind is at rest. This is all I have ever wanted. Now I can die happily." And so if you go to Vietnam today, you will see there are books about this, and these people are in the public press and in newspapers. And it's a very interesting way that, again, popular religion, popular ritual is being mobilized as a way to deal with these legacies of violence. The second one then, we've covered that, and we only have 45 minutes, so we'll get into this one, is the case of child soldiers in Uganda. And as I mentioned, this was research done by one of my graduate students. And a little bit of history here. After 1986, there was a great deal of violence in Uganda amongst an ethnic group called the Acholi. These are going to be sort of in the upper parts of the country. In 1986, you saw the emergence of what was called the Holy Spirit movement, defeated in 1987, and then afterwards it became the Lord's Resistance Army. And this still exists. This is, if you saw the documentary Coney, it deals with the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army. But while we have this history of violence, by 1994 they were recruiting child soldiers. So child soldiers were being actively brought in, often by force, into the movement. And these, again, are young people, 10, 15 years old, sometimes younger, in many cases being sort of forced to fight in the Lord's Resistance Army. But, and it was, by 2007, it was estimated they had abducted somewhere between 20 to 25,000 child soldiers. And so you have literally tens of thousands of these. 80% of them were under 18, and 50% were between 11 and 16 years old, so very young people. And so with the initiation into the Lord's Resistance Army, there was always violence involved. Usually they were expected to kill somebody, either a child who tried to escape or a family member. So it was a very, very brutal scene. And so with this then, in this my student's research, she noted that child soldiers are what we refer to in the social sciences as liminal. Anybody know this word? It's a great word. It comes back from the scholar Arnold van Gennep, talking about rites of passage. And liminal means in between statuses, all right? And it comes from Latin word for threshold. This would be a limit in Latin. And if I stand like this, I have 1 foot in, I have 1 foot out. I'm neither in nor out. So I'm in between. And this is liminal. And it's a wonderful, it's a very powerful idea in the social sciences. And so these child soldiers then, what my student and others have noted is that they were liminal in the sense that they had kind of fallen out of the normal social structure, but they were still part of society. And as often happened is that they're often received with fear. They're often not treated differently. And many were seen as threatening and morally corrupt for having served as child soldiers and been involved in the activities in the LRA. But following the end of or most of the end of the conflict, there was a movement program that was initiated called DDR, for disarmament, so disarming the soldiers, demobilizing them, taking them out of the LRA. But also the most important one was reintegration, of trying to get these young people who have been child soldiers and bring them back into society. And this was the focus of my students' research of how do they go about meaningfully reintegrating these people who have been in the situation. And the goal of DDR, as was noted, was, quote, to regain punitive innocence and be non-threatening, not harbingers of spiritual and physical violence. So in a sense, to make them so they're no longer considered to be a threat, that they're in some way absolved of the activities that they have engaged in. And culturally, and this is a very interesting part of my students' research, was that when looking at these child soldiers, they obviously had engaged in a great deal of violence. But there was also this important cultural dimension. And this is something that you see if you study African societies, you see this association quite clearly. And that is that in thinking about the world, there is the village where people live, and this is associated with humans, with civilization, morality, order, things like this. And then the bush, which is associated with animals, spirits, danger, disorder, things like this. And so it is culturally constructed as this is sort of safe and this is dangerous. And then when you read the ethnography of Africa, you see this over and over again. And so these child soldiers then, in terms of how they were sort of culturally perceived, they were associated with the bush, with danger, with disorder, with these important cultural categories. And in my student's research, she was noting that much of their behavior when they came back into these communities was described as sort of bush behavior. And this was in particular to show any aggression, to be nonconformist, and also just for standing up for themselves. And in my student's research, this was very interesting. She noted that, I have it here, that when people interacted with the former child soldiers, any mistake they made was interpreted as being the result of them having this sort of bush mentality of having this. And so what it led to then was the stigmatization of these young people. So they're associated in this negative way, and then in addition to that, they have the stigma attached to them. And so some of the ideas that came up in, or some of the sentences that came out in my students' research was describing these young people, especially female child soldiers, as being of the bush, from the bush, excuse me, you've been killing me, we don't want you, calling them mad, things like this. And so, in a sense, when you look at the use of particularly of this anthropologically, that it indicates how this is a kind of culturally constructed problem. And so, but there were some other important things as well, and that is that for many of them, and this is something that was very important in these societies, is that the social expectation for people is to marry, that at some point in their life they will get married. And for the child soldiers, what happened to them for the females was that there was no one to pay what was referred to as bride price. It was a way of, in these societies, in order for a marriage to be finalized, there has to be some sort of payment, okay? And this is, you don't think of it as like writing a check or something. These are kind of culturally expected gifts. And when we study societies, when I got married, my wife was Vietnamese, and I had to present their family with a roasted pig. This was sort of part of the transactions that go on in different societies. I have different ways of doing this. And so with these young women, then they fall out of their social structures, their clans, and so this creates other problems. And so they were undesirable marriage partners. And so in my students' research, as she said then, this liminality was central. They were really not part of the social structure, and they had to find ways to sort of integrate them. But also, for the younger women, that they did ultimately want to marry and have families. These were some of the things that they had to deal with: the mother-in-laws fearing them, being interpreted as causing bush behavior in their families, things of this nature. And so what happens then? How do you sort of solve this issue? And in her research, she discovered a number of very interesting things. And what I found so interesting about her research was that, similar to like the Vietnamese case, is what you saw was the engagement with pre-existing ritual practices. And one very important one was this, I don't know how to pronounce it, the use of what's called the Mato Oput ritual, which is called drinking the bitter root. And this is a photograph of it. And the idea behind this is that you have two families, two individuals that have a conflict, and then they will sort of sit down and sort of basically talk it out between them, and then to finalize it, they will drink this bitter root together. And so it becomes a culturally meaningful way of recognizing and resolving particularly instances where violence has occurred. And this, if you're interested, the BBC does have a nice article on this as well. Another one that she discovered in her research was the Nyono Tongueno, which is called the stepping on the egg. And with this, and this is an idea we'll see in other cases as well, is a cleansing of the bad spirits from the body. And this is a really interesting idea because, in a sense, what it's doing is you have these people that have been in the bush, who are associated with the bush, and this is going to be associated with impurity. It's going to be associated with culturally informed pollution, and in this case in particular, bad spirits getting into the body from being out in the bush. And so with this, it becomes a culturally significant way of purification. And in a sense, the body is purified so it can be returned into the village. So you have this effort then, as we think about it here, that you have, on one hand, this boundary between the bush and the village, and through this form of purification, that the individual can sort of cross the boundary and be reintegrated, become part of the community again. And then there was another one that, another ritual that she came across here, the Moyo Kum, the cleansing of the body. And this was particularly after being held as a child soldier. And another purification ritual. And so for anthropologists, this is really interesting stuff because we're always very interested in purity and impurity. How is it that culturally impurity is defined? And also how is it eliminated? And in my students' research, she noted that they were mobilizing these pre-existing rituals as a way to kind of order their bodies, to purify their bodies so that they could return, they could become members of the village communities again. And this is very important because in many cases with the incidents that happens, it's very hard to get it into like a court system. And so in terms of like a formal judicial system, and so this becomes an important way for people to deal with violence in a meaningful way. There have been other instances of this as well, and to give you a couple of examples of these, in Sierra Leone, where you had large numbers of child soldiers during the wars there in the 1990s, in Sierra Leone, they created what were called rituals of welcome. And these were another way of sort of overcoming this boundary and integrating these girls into the community. In Angola, also, you had purification rituals, a certain type of cleansing rituals that was performed after exposure to killing. And here again, if you think about it in these broader anthropological terms of purity and impurity, it's a way of purifying a body that has been exposed to violence, that has been engaged in violence. Mozambique, where you also had a bitter civil war, traditional healers would hold rites for what they described as taking the war out of the people, that they had been involved in warfare, and this was a way to sort of remove that. And here again, I would call it a purification ceremony. And then we saw this in Nepal as well. That's for a very interesting study that was done about child soldiers who were fighting in Nepal. And what was interesting is that Nepal is a caste-based society, and so there were certain caste rules that were broken. The one that was very interesting to me was that in caste societies, you don't eat with people of other castes. You only eat with people of your same caste, but these child soldiers were eating with people in other castes, and so they would hold this purification ceremony afterwards. So if you look at this then, if we start thinking about these legacies of violence, you can see in a sense it's transformative. And it puts people in particular as in particular, it's putting people into a kind of socially negative category. And it can be impurity, it can be being part of the bush, etc. But what anthropology has really contributed on this point then is the way that people have turned to pre-existing practices and use these to deal with the legacies of the violence that has beset their communities. And so just to wrap this up then, the concluding points, as I say here, anthropological studies can be beneficial for understanding traditional systems of justice. And that's one way that people describe things like drinking of the bitter root. That's a traditional justice mechanism, a way of resolving a dispute. There are also ways of solving culturally informed problems created by conflict and warfare. And what's been interesting is the spread of this, that you see many societies now that are trying to come up with, in a post-conflict scenario, that are trying to come up with these innovative ritual mechanisms in order to deal with these legacies of violence. And ultimately, then, in my work and my students and many people who've worked on these issues as well, it does tell us how people innovatively cope with the legacies of violence, conflict, and warfare. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, with my students, this is one of their sort of favorite topics. Many students here do peace studies degrees, and many want to go and work in post-conflict societies. And they're always very interested in how is it then that we can create meaningful ways of resolving conflict, how we can create meaningful ways of dealing with these legacies of violence. And here I've just given you two, looking at ritual in Vietnam and in Uganda, but it really is a much bigger ritual that has, a much bigger literature that has a great deal to contribute. Good. Well, I think we have convinced some people, so thank you for your input there. And I think, so we're at 45, so I think I'm supposed to stop so you can get on to the next stage of things. So thank you all for coming, and sorry it's kind of warm in here today and after lunch, but thank you for being here. And again, I'll be here for a couple minutes. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.